There is a moment in geopolitics when something that was once considered a joke stops being funny. That moment, for Canada, arrived sometime in late 2024, and by the time 2026 rolled around, it had hardened into something far more serious, a national reckoning. The days of laughing off Donald Trump's threats to turn Canada into the 51st state of the United States are long past. A new reality has rippled across Canada, that the United States under Trump is, as strange as it is to stomach, suddenly Canada's largest national security threat. Let that sink in. Not Russia, not China, the United States of America, Canada's neighbor, its largest trading partner, its closest military ally for over 8 decades, is now being spoken about in Ottawa in the same breath as adversarial powers. That is not hyperbole. That is the documented, on-record assessment of Canadian policymakers, academics, and strategists in the year 2026. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning of this confrontation and understand what Trump was actually doing when he started throwing around the phrase 51st state. Because it was never purely a joke, and it was never purely a provocation. It was a negotiating strategy with deep ideological roots, and it carried real economic teeth. Trump had started suggesting Canada should become the 51st state, and tariffs posed an acute risk for a country that sends over 75% of its exports south of the border. Trade makes up 2/3 of Canada's GDP. Think about that arithmetic for a moment. 2/3 of Canada's entire economic output is bound up in trade, and 3/4 of that trade goes to one country. The United States, in other words, didn't just have leverage over Canada, it had Canada in a headlock, and Trump knew it. His advisors knew it. And for years, Canadian politicians on both sides had quietly known it too, even if they never said it aloud. What changed everything was not just the tariffs and not just the rhetoric. It was the combination. It was the deliberate pairing of economic coercion with sovereignty mockery, with the explicit goal of making Canada feel small, dependent, and ultimately negotiable. Trump doubled down on his suggestion that Canada should become the 51st state, calling it a wonderful marriage that would provide Canadians with tax cuts and military protection, but acknowledging that it is not solely his decision to make. He called former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau Governor Trudeau, not Prime Minister Governor. That is not a slip of the tongue. That is a political statement, a deliberate framing designed to preemptively demote a sovereign nation's leader to the level of an American state executive. It was an act of rhetorical annexation, and Canadians heard it loud and clear. The Canadian public's reaction was immediate and visceral. What was initially an unusual swell of Canadian patriotism a year ago has evolved into a new social and economic order for the country of 41 million. The shift has affected everything from what brands Canadians buy to where they vacation to how they vote. This is not a small thing. Consumer behavior is one of the most stubborn forces in any society. People don't change their shopping habits easily, and they especially don't abandon American brands, which have dominated Canadian retail for generations, without a deep emotional rupture. But that rupture happened. Canadians began moving their food purchases away from the United States starting in early 2025. Domestic brands gained wallet share as retailers and liquor stores encouraged shoppers to buy Canadian instead. The boycott reached into travel, into tourism, into sport. Canadian return trips from the United States by air plunged almost 18% in the year through January. Car crossings by Canadians from the United States tumbled nearly 27% year over year in January. Canadian bookings at United States mountain destinations sank more than 45% in January 2026 from the same month a year ago. These are extraordinary numbers. These are not protest marches and hashtags. These are real dollars being withheld from the American economy by ordinary Canadian citizens, acting not on instruction from their government, but out of genuine, sustained, organic fury. Now, here's where the analysis gets interesting. Because what Canada did next was not simply emotional or reactive, it was strategic. And the man who gave that strategy a face, a framework, and a political mandate was Mark Carney. Carney is a rare figure in modern democratic politics, a technocrat with genuine intellectual authority who managed to translate economic theory into national mobilization. He had served as governor of the Bank of Canada and then as governor of the Bank of England during the Brexit crisis. He understood, perhaps better than any other leader on earth, what it means when a country's economic architecture is suddenly called into question. And when Trump came after Canada, Carney saw it not just as a political attack, but as a structural vulnerability that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Carney said Canada's strong economic ties to the United States were once a strength, but are now a weakness that must be corrected. That sentence is worth pausing on because it represents a fundamental reframing of Canadian national identity. For generations, proximity to the United States was Canada's greatest asset. It meant guaranteed markets, shared security, interoperable supply chains, and a kind of comfortable, frictionless prosperity. Carney looked at all of that and said, "The very thing we thought made us strong has made us fragile." And he was right. His response was to go to Davos in January 2026 and deliver a speech that the world's financial establishment received with something approaching standing applause. During a speech in January at the World Economic Forum in Davos, he received widespread praise for condemning economic coercion by great powers against small countries. Trump's response was instinctive and revealing. He said simply, "Canada lives because of the United States." That is the logic of a landlord, not an ally. That is the language of dependency being used as a weapon, and Carney refused to accept the premise. Carney said he told Trump he meant what he said at Davos, and that Canada plans to diversify away from the United States with a dozen new trade deals, 12 new economic and security accords in 6 months, a deal with China to lower trade levies, which immediately prompted Trump to threaten a 100% tariff on Canadian goods. Carney highlighted in particular a new agreement with China and said he expected the United States to respect Canada's sovereignty. The use of the word expects there is deliberate diplomatic language. You do not say, "I expect" to a partner. You say it to someone you are putting on notice. The confrontation came to its most publicly dramatic moment in May of 2025, when Carney walked into the Oval Office for a face-to-face meeting with Trump following his election victory. The exchange that followed became one of the defining moments of this entire crisis. Carney made his government's position clear. As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale. We're sitting in one now. Having met with the owners of Canada during the last several months, it's not for sale. It won't be for sale ever. He used Trump's own language, the language of real estate, of transactions, of deals, to shut the door permanently. And Trump's response was, "Never say never." That is not a concession. That is a man who has not given up. And everyone in that room and everyone watching that exchange understood exactly what was being communicated on both sides. But the most consequential part of what Canada did was not the rhetoric. Rhetoric is cheap. What shocked Washington, and here is the core of the story, was that Canada backed up its words with money, with policy, with structural transformation of the kind that takes years to reverse, and it did it fast. In March 2026, NATO confirmed that Canada achieved its 2% of GDP defense expenditure target, half a decade ahead of the previous government's schedule, and for the first time since the fall of the Berlin Wall. In 2025-26, Canada spent more than $63 billion on its defense, marking the single largest year-on-year increase in defense investment in generations. That last sentence deserves to be read very slowly. The single largest year-on-year increase in defense investment in Canadian history. Not since World War II, not since the Cold War, not since 9/11, now. In response to pressure from its neighbor and supposed ally. In Budget 2025, Canada announced $81.8 billion over 5 years to rebuild, rearm, and reinvest in the Canadian Armed Forces. And the ambition doesn't stop there. At the NATO summit, Carney committed to raising the level to 5% of GDP by 2035, 3.5% directly spent on the military, and 1.5% for defense infrastructure. If that target were met today, defense spending would nearly triple from where it stood just 2 years ago. The political will behind this is real. According to a recent ECOS poll, 72% of Canadians supported the Carney government's plan to meet the NATO target of spending the equivalent of 5% of GDP on defense by 2035. That compares to just 36% less than a year ago in a separate Angus Reid poll. In the space of 12 months, support for tripling the military budget nearly doubled. That is a nation that has been changed by what it has lived through. The defense buildup is also deliberate in its design. It is not just about buying American weapons through American contractors. Canada wants its own industrial base. Canada's new defense industrial strategy sets a goal of awarding 70% of federal defense contracts to Canadian firms within a decade. Think about what that means. Canada is not just arming itself. It is trying to ensure that its armaments industry is domestically owned, domestically operated, and not dependent on American supply chains that could, in theory, be cut off. It is building sovereignty into the supply chain itself. As part of Canada's NORAD modernization plan, a $32 billion investment is designed to move Canada from reliance to resilience, reducing dependence on the United States for Arctic defense, while boosting infrastructure for both military and economic purposes. The Arctic is worth dwelling on because it sits at the center of both the strategic and symbolic contest between Ottawa and Washington. The Arctic is Canada's most exposed frontier, vast, sparsely populated, difficult to monitor, and increasingly contested as climate change opens up new shipping routes and makes its resource wealth more accessible. Trump's interest in Greenland is not unrelated to his interest in Canada's northern territories. French President Emmanuel Macron cited the threat to Canada becoming the 51st state as an example of American foreign policy that is sacrificing allies for the law of the strongest, noting that everyday people wonder whether Greenland will be invaded, whether Canada will be under the threat of becoming the 51st state, or whether Taiwan is to be further circled. Macron placed Canada in the same sentence as Greenland and Taiwan, three different theaters of what is fundamentally the same assertion of great power coercion by the Trump administration. The world is watching, and the world is not applauding. Canadian global security expert Thomas Homer Dixon noted that any U.S. pressure on Canada would be extremely costly. Canadian authorities are also concerned about political risks, pointing to events in Venezuela, where Trump succeeded in establishing control over oil resources, demonstrating his willingness to take decisive action to strengthen his influence in the region. Venezuela is the ghost that haunts every backroom conversation in Ottawa. If a president was willing to engineer or support regime change in Venezuela to secure oil, what exactly is the limiting principle when it comes to a country that sits on the largest freshwater reserves on the planet? Some of the world's most significant oil sands, the world's longest coastline, and a vast Arctic territory that is only becoming more strategically valuable by the year? Canada has asked itself that question, found no satisfying answer, and decided the only response is capability. Yet there are analysts and voices, important ones, who are urging caution alongside the buildup. The worry is that Canada is letting Washington set its agenda. Carleton University Associate Professor Philippe Legas argues that the more Canada makes concessions to maintain trade relations and reduce pressure from the United States, the greater the risk of a gradual loss of sovereignty. He believes the country could find itself in the position of a de facto subordinate state, even if it doesn't officially acknowledge it. This is the sharpest blade in the entire debate, and it cuts in a direction that the nationalist energy often misses. Yes, Canada is saying not for sale. Yes, Canada is rearming. But every time Ottawa adjusts a tariff or modifies a policy or softens a position in response to American pressure, it is demonstrating that the coercion works. The question of how to be resolute without being provocative, how to stand firm without triggering an escalation that Canada cannot win, is one that Carney's government has not fully answered. Trump's annexation rhetoric may be many things, but at minimum, it is a signal that Canada cannot plan its defense around assumptions of unconditional American partnership. The bilateral relationship has shifted in ways Ottawa is still absorbing. And there is a hard truth buried in the defense surge. Canada is declaring a sovereignty it cannot yet fully enforce. The sensors, the infrastructure, the trained personnel. Much of it is still years from delivery. The money has been committed, but commitment and capability are not the same thing. And in the interim, Canada's northern territories remain genuinely exposed. The gap between political will and operational reality is where adversaries, including the United States, can still apply pressure. But zoom out, and the picture is something that historians will find remarkable. The past 80 or so years of US-Canada comedy, in which the world's longest border was largely peaceable, and in which Washington and Ottawa became perhaps the closest allies in the entire world, may increasingly seem like an anachronism, an anomaly in which the United States simply paused on its far broader history of expansion in North America. That framing, that the peaceful, collaborative 20th century relationship was the exception rather than the rule, is a genuinely unsettling reframe of North American history. The United States has a deep territorial acquisition tradition: Louisiana, Florida, Texas, California, Alaska, Hawaii. The idea that a country which expanded so relentlessly for a century would simply stop at the 49th parallel has always required a story of American goodwill to sustain it. Trump, in a strange way, has dissolved that story. And in doing so, he has forced Canada to think about itself not as America's most trusted friend, but as a sovereign nation that must maintain that sovereignty through its own effort. With the United States no longer the anchor of a rules-based order, and with there now being a deep rupture caused by changes in Washington, Carney has aimed to build at home and diversify abroad, as Ottawa's dependence and long ties have now become a source of weakness. And he is doing this at a speed, scale, and ambition that we haven't seen in recent years. That is a remarkable statement from a senior analyst at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, and it captures what is genuinely new about this moment. The speed matters, the ambition matters, but what matters most is the psychological transformation that underlies all of it. Canada no longer trusts that the United States will protect it, and it is building, as fast as it can, a version of itself that does not need that protection. What did Canada do next? It did something no one in Washington fully anticipated. It chose itself. It chose its own brands, its own military, its own trade partners, its own sovereignty narrative. It elected a prime minister who walked into the Oval Office and used the language of real estate to tell the most powerful man in the world that there are things that are simply not for sale. And then it went home and started spending $63 billion on its armed forces, signed 12 new trade deals, and told its citizens to buy Canadian, not as a slogan, but as a structural reorientation of the national economy. Washington may have expected a Canada that would quietly comply, that would accept the pressure and adjust. It got something very different. It got a Canada that looked at 80 years of partnership, calculated the cost of dependency, and decided that the era of taking American goodwill for granted was over. Whether that Canada can sustain this transformation, whether the money will translate into real capability, whether the trade diversification can compensate for the sheer weight of American economic dominance, whether Carney can hold together a coalition of provinces with wildly different interests behind a single sovereignty project. Those are the questions that 2026 has not yet answered. But the question of whether Canada would resist, that one is settled. And Washington, for all its leverage, did not see it coming.